Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Problem Gambling, Gambling Motivated Crime and Gender. I am Malkin Thurton from New York Council on Problem Gambling, and you'll notice my name begins with staff on the participant list. I'll be here during the session in case you have any technology issues or questions. If you need assistance or have questions for the presenter, please type them in the chat box at any time. We'll be doing Q&A at the end of the presentation, and we have allowed 10 to 15 minutes to answer all questions and answers. So I'll be recording questions as we go along and holding them until that time. At this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Michelle Malkin. She's a PhD Assistant Professor of Criminal Justice at the East Carolina University. Thank you, Dr. Malkin. And at this time, I'm going to turn over the controls to you for you to begin your presentation.
Thank you so much. I look forward to engaging in this conversation with you all. And thank you to the New York Council for inviting me to do this. As indicated, my name is Dr. Michelle Malkin. Please note that my email is here. It'll also be shared at the end. If you do need a copy of my presentation, I am happy to send it out. Just send me an email. I'm also happy to engage in any conversation of questions that people may have, etc., beyond just today's session. So today's session on problem gambling, gambling motivated crime, and gender is based on a lot of the research that I do as a criminologist. So the way today's session is going to go is I'm going to present a basic overview of gambling motivated crime, how it's related to problem gambling, what up-to-date research kind of says. And I also focus on gender similarities and differences. I share a research study I've done on the social, economic, and legal consequences of gambling with a kind of focus on gender within that. We're going to explore problem gambling within the criminal justice system, how the criminal justice system can be providing more resources and offer practical considerations for any of you who may be practitioners who treat problem gamblers who may face consequences due to problem gambling. So my research focus as an assistant professor is primarily on applying criminal justice theories to understanding problem gambling. This is kind of a new area for research, as a lot of the problem gambling research, as you probably know, apply a lot of sociology, social work, psychological, etc. Theories, and I do a lot around criminology, and then also a major focus on gambling motivated crime in general. So what do I mean by this term, gambling motivated crime? A lot of you probably haven't heard it in those words. I kind of decided I really wanted to focus on gambling motivated crime over other areas of crime that occurs due to gambling. And so primarily there's three types of crime when it comes to casinos, gambling, etc. There's property crimes in around gambling establishments due to the existence of these gambling establishments. And there's a lot of research around increase or not in terms of property crimes. And then there's a lot of research out there on illegal gambling, underground gambling, things connected to organized crime, et cetera. That's a whole nother area of research. My research focuses on those kinds of crimes that are committed by problem gamblers, primarily because of furtherance of their addiction of gambling, the need to keep gambling and or to pay off gambling debts. This can even include crimes because they've lost all their money gambling. They're using the money to pay rent, the basic things of necessities, because they no longer have money due to gambling. There is some evidence that problem gamblers commit other types of crimes, not just acquisitional in nature. However, those are very few compared to the number of crimes we see committed that are kind of these financial, non-violent crimes to keep gambling and or pay off gambling debts. The most common types of gambling motivated crimes traditionally are embezzlement, larceny, theft, robbery, counterfeit money. If you can think about ways in which people might be able to get their hands on money quickly, those are the kinds of crimes. However, they're most often committed against family, friends, and employers. And why that is these are really crimes of trust. The individuals trusted the person who happens to have a gambling problem with money or access to money. It could be as part of their job. It could be they have access to funds or accounts within their family, access to credit cards that aren't in their name, checkbooks, etc. So these are very much crimes of trust. And interestingly, according to research, gambling is the second most frequent motivation for serious fraud prosecutions. And it's important to note that gambling is the second most frequent motivation, whereas greed is the first most frequent motivation. And see, greed, which usually is they're taking the money to buy the big house, take lavish vacations, etc. That's not why people who have a gambling problem are taking the money. They're literally taking the money to further gambling or pay off these gambling debts. So this overall idea of what gambling motivated crime is has been supported by a very recent meta-analysis looking at all historical studies of crimes committed by problem gamblers. And what they found was that the gambling related crime they were looking at was most often a product of gambling to further funds in order to gamble, recruit financial losses, or conceal the gambling from other people. And they also found that the gambling crime relationship could not be explained solely by financial motivations, that idea of greed. That is not what they were finding. What they did find is that it's the gambling, it's the need for continuing access to money that causes these types of crimes. So I like to kind of look at why gamblers commit these crimes as this kind of cyclical thing that's a little different than a lot of other addictions. What happens with a gambler is as they continue to face different kinds of debts and problems because of their problem gambling, they can't stop. They are mounting huge debts, their relationships are falling apart, they might be having problems at work. So they have these huge number of gambling problems associated with the gambling. But in the gambler's mind, they're thinking the only way they can fix those problems is to keep gambling. And all they need is that next big win. The big win is going to pay off and fix all these gambling problems. The problem is it's very cyclical because they gamble, they either continue to dig the hole deeper or it's just not enough. They continue to have new problems and they just keep going. And this is a little different than some other addictions because while the next drug may make you feel better inside, people who are drug addicts aren't thinking, I'm going to fix all of my problems in society if I continue doing drugs or continue drinking alcohol. Gambling does have that cyclical thing, and they get stuck in this huge pattern. However, I do mention this because I think it's important for anybody who's looking at gambling motivated crime to understand that although I am primarily interested in acquisitional crimes, those crimes to keep gambling and pay off gambling debts, there is some evidence of also violent crimes. While they are much less frequent, here is a quote directly from an online forum on Facebook. Just literally last week, somebody posted this, and it just shows the kind of rage that can develop because the individual's partner was holding their money and not giving it to them. And that resulted in what I would identify as more of a violent crime because they ended up shoving the person who ended up injured because of that. So those types of violent crimes do exist. And there's also some evidence that there might be increased domestic violence in general, but we're not quite sure, according to research, if most of the domestic violence is towards the person with a gambling problem or by the person with the gambling problem. So a lot of more research in this area still needs to exist. So how common is it that people are committing these crimes? Well, it's a lot more common than people realize. And part of the reason it's more common than people realize is the majority of people never face any kind of criminal consequences for their actions. But based on what the research shows, about half of those people seeking help, and of course, most people don't seek help till they're more advanced in their severity of problem gambling, but at least half of those people seeking help tend to report commission of a crime to keep gambling or pay off those gambling related debts. And the more severe the gambling addiction, and we know this in terms of almost every assessment there is, the more severe on that, the more likely they are to have committed a crime. In fact, as many of 2/3 of the most severe compulsive gamblers admit to committing crimes, which is amazing because most of them will never face consequences. And the fact that they're even admitting it says a lot. And yet most of them don't face criminal consequences. Why? Well, I mentioned earlier, most of these crimes are against family, friends, employers, and they're crimes of trust. And a lot of times those are a lot of people like to handle them within their private groups. They don't want to bring in the police, press charges, etc. And so criminal sanctions just are not as common with these kinds of crimes, even though they can be pretty big. In fact, they can be quite large. According to a very old study, and there hasn't really been a newer study, 184 GA members had stolen an average of over $60,000. And in total at that time, they had estimated over $11 million. And that was only from 184 individuals who had committed these crimes. So it could have a huge cost on society. As I mentioned, although that's the truth, there's still very little evidence of most people facing criminal sanctions for that. And I want to mention, most of you probably are familiar with the change that occurred between the DSM-4 and the DSM-5 when it came to gambling disorder. Under the DSM-4, gambling was within this idea of impulse control disorders. And in the DSM-5, it moved to addiction right alongside drugs and alcohol. And at the same time that they moved the DSM-5, they took away one of the criteria. And that is a very relevant criteria to this discussion because they took away commission of illegal activity in order to gamble or pay off gambling debts. And why they took that away is they weren't seeing that this one question actually was helpful in diagnosing whether somebody actually had gambling disorder. It didn't increase the likelihood that they would or would not be deemed to have gambling disorder, but it also was more of an indication of severity of the disorder rather than having it to begin with. So people who have a less severe gambling addiction and have not moved towards the severity yet, because we know it's progressive and most likely they would move up in the progression thing, they are much less likely to have committed a crime than those people further down. But taking away this question also has led to a lot of people not being assessed for whether they've committed a crime or not. So that's a question we'll get to in a little bit. So for me and my research, I really want to understand the relationship between problem gambling and crime. And so most research up to now has looked at it kind of as just, is there a relationship? Yes, people who have the most severe types of gambling disorder are more likely to have committed a crime. There's some sort of relationship. But as Banks in his recent book had recently discussed, he mentioned that there's almost no research on what's happening to the problem gambler between the time that they kind of identify as a problem gambler to the time that they actually commit a crime. And so that is the area of which I do most of my research. So this theory called general strain theory, which is a criminological theory, says that criminal behavior or other kinds of bad behaviors occur because of the negative emotions caused by certain types of strain. This probably just makes sense, right? And so we've already shown through a lot of research, there's a couple of research studies that show, yes, increased numbers of amounts of strain can cause these negative emotions and they're more likely to be problem gamblers. What I'm trying to show is, yes, strain may have resulted in people moving into problem gambling, but it's the strain caused by the increased consequences of problem gambling, social, economic, and possibly legal, that then result in new kinds of emotions, new kinds of desperation. And those types of things are what leads to criminal behavior. So that's kind of where my personal research is focused. And so I examine this relationship, and I do it in a number of ways. And the first study I'm going to talk with you about is one of my earliest studies looking at whether this relationship exists. So my study on social, economic, and criminal consequences of problem gambling with a focus on gender started with a small n. It's only 195 people, but as you know, it is difficult to do these studies with problem gamblers. You can't walk into casinos, assess whether somebody's a problem gambler, and then do a survey. So I was lucky to be able to do this nationally with Gamblers Anonymous members, looking at their behaviors, their history, the different kinds of consequences they faced, and any criminal behaviors and histories that they had. And one of the things I wanted to try to understand through my research questions were answering the question, maybe these are just bad eggs, people who would commit crimes anyway, and they're just using problem gambling or their issues around gambling as an excuse, or is it that there is a relationship between problem gambling and the crime? And also, what kinds of crimes do these people admit to committing, and how frequent are those? And also, are they likely to lead to conviction, or are there certain kinds of crimes that are more likely to lead to conviction? So these were the kinds of questions I was asking in this research. And why do I include a gender lens? Well, if you look at the history of most research in problem gambling, it's been primarily done on men, as many of you know, and there's kind of this big upswing of research done on women, but not in this arena around gambling crime. And in fact, most research will say that women are not only less likely to be problem gamblers, it will also say they're less likely to commit a crime related to their gambling. But women have always been gambling. They may not have been gambling in the traditional sense, but you could look back even when the United States was being formed, there were women who were poker players, some that even owned poker rooms. There are women who ran numbers for other women and people of color who were kind of not allowed to play in traditional gambling establishments, etc. However, we do know that as gambling kind of expanded around the United States, and also as women became a larger part of the workforce and started to have some of their own expendable money, they were more likely to start to gamble more frequently. And so at the same time, we had a total lack of knowledge on what the social, economic, and legal consequences are based on gender. So I really wanted to include that gendered lens. And another gender plug to throw in there is to understand that slot machines in casinos actually started, if you look at the history of slots, around the perimeter of the card rooms. Because what was happening is the casinos were trying to bring in men to play in the card rooms. The wives were bored, and so they put up slot machines to kind of engage the wives while the men played. And what happened is the casinos discovered they were making more through these slot machines than they were the table games. So if you look at the modern casino, obviously most of the floor is filled with slot machines, and far less are now with table games. But it kind of led to this kind of assumption that women were slot players and men were card players and liked more action games. But really, it was a socialization effect of men being introduced to cards and other kinds of games in a different way that women were. And if you start to look at what it looks like on a casino floor today, you're going to see just as many men as women kind of in the slot areas, and just as many women as men at the table games. So a lot of the historical research is kind of off, I believe, in terms of how they look at gender and gameplay. But this is historically what the research has kind of said about women gamblers compared to male gamblers. And that is that women are less likely to be problem gamblers. They generally start gambling later in life than men. However, they may move to problem gambling quicker. And this might be mostly connected to the fact that there's been research to show that people who play slot machines may move to problem gambling quicker. It may not have so much to do with gender as it does with access to the types of games that they tend to play. Women tend to prefer less forms of gambling, meaning men might try multiple kinds of games and women may stick to less types of games. Women who are problem gamblers may be more likely to be divorced or widowed, less educated than men, but of course that's a socialized thing. If you're looking at older people, access to education has always been different for women than men. Today's day, very different. More women are getting a higher education than men. Women are seen to have a lower economic status, and fewer women attend GA or seek help for gambling, which I find very interesting because my research strongly suggests that most of these historical findings are no longer true when it comes to women and problem gamblers. So what my research showed, specifically in terms of demographics and based on that, is that first of all, women were just as likely to be in GA as men, and for the average same amount of years, 5 to 10 year average, both men and women. And somehow my survey resulted in more females from Gamblers Anonymous filling it out than men, which is one of the first studies that looked at Gamblers Anonymous that has that as the reality. A lot of times when people have done historical research using Gamblers Anonymous, it's been primarily men, which is why a lot of the findings were that men were more likely to be seeking this help. The average age for most were over 55 years old, mostly Caucasian. There weren't a lot of differences between men and women in any status. The only two big things that were different were men had a slightly higher current income, which is after being in GA, but that's probably true about society in general. And women were more likely to be divorced or separated. Other than that, there was no statistical differences between men and women in the study. So what was the behavioral differences? As I said, historically, they say women are less likely to play as many kinds of games. They're more likely to play in the slots. As you can see, that's somewhat true and somewhat not true. What the study showed were that most people played most of the same kinds of games. 73% of the respondents had played card games for gambling. And while men did play significantly more frequently than women, 87% of the men had, over 50% of the women had. So automatically assuming that women weren't card players is a mistake because we have actually almost 60% of women playing card games too. And as you see, depending on the area, they're not that big difference in dice games, lottery, 85% of men versus only 80% of women. And that's a little different than a lot of the research has shown in the past. And then we get to slots where almost 100% of the women said that they played slots, but 85% of the men. So we can't call slots more of a female game than a male game, because you see in this that while there might be some statistical differences between men and women, they're all playing all sorts of games. And I thought that was really interesting given past research. But then start to look at the social and economic consequences, and there were only two major differences between men and women. Men were much more likely to have lost an educational opportunity than women, but women were more likely to have taken out a credit card advance. When you look at what those two are, once again, we're looking at people who are over the age of 55. Women were less likely to even have had the opportunity to go to college. So the loss of an education opportunity could be much more due to gender than the differences in gender and gambling. And women having a consequence of taking out credit card advance may be more due to where they have access to funds versus men who may have other avenues. But if you look at all these other social and economic consequences, there were no statistical differences between men and women. Over 46% had lost a relative. Over 30% had lost a job. Over 75% had borrowed money from somebody else to help pay for gambling or pay off debts. Over 37% had taken out payday loans. As you can see, all these social and economic consequences, which were just kind of put out to them, there is a very high percentage of people who are seeking help for gambling who have faced these types of consequences. Over 20%, 1 in 5 had lost a house. Almost 30% had filed for bankruptcy. So without a gender difference, there were a lot of social and economic consequences. Not very surprising, given that most of our assessments on problem gambling look at these kinds of consequences, not this specific oftentimes, but these kinds of consequences often are entailed into the different kinds of assessments. But looking at what percentage of people who are seeking help have these different ones was very interesting. So then trying to take it a step further, of course, I was interested in had you faced criminal consequences of your gambling. Over 56% had admitted to committing at least one financial crime related to gambling. And it's important to say related to the gambling, because they were also asked whether they had committed any of these crimes not related to gambling. And they were not just asked about financial crimes, and the right side of the screen shows the financial crimes that were being assessed, but also whether they had committed any crime. And as you see, the difference between committing any crime and financial crime is very little. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that the vast majority, when asked about individually these different financial crimes, over 76% had written a bad check. And if I actually assessed all of you all and asked if you've ever written a bad check, most of you would probably say yes too at some point. So when I ended up doing a lot of my assessment, I had to take out the writing of a bad check just because it's too common, too frequent of a crime that people don't even consider a crime, because if they had this number instead of 56%, would have been over 75%. So taking out the writing of a bad check. But you can see here that over 5% were facing current charges, but over 14% had been arrested at some point for a gambling motivated crime. And of those, over 6% had been found guilty of a misdemeanor, over 8%, almost 9% guilty of felony, and just over 8% had been incarcerated. What I found specifically interesting about this is there was no difference between men and women, no statistical difference. And in fact, if you look at current charges, women were twice as likely to be facing current charges than men, which indicates that some of that earlier research that women aren't doing this as much, et cetera, may not necessarily be true. So I was specifically interested in that kind of question of, are these just bad eggs? Are they people who just would be more likely to commit a crime anyway, and therefore they're just blaming this on motivation by gambling? So I asked about each of the crimes, both not related to gambling and motivated by gambling. As you can see, the only crime that kind of has a very high frequency for not related to gambling is the use of an illegal drug. I will say that that includes the use of marijuana, which is now legalized in many states, but it's really disconnected from the other kinds of crimes here. And I was looking at specifically these kind of acquisitional crimes. So I can see that towards the end, it kind of cuts off. So after it took money from an employer, there's obtained a credit card in somebody else's name without permission, used somebody else's credit card without permission, or wrote a check from somebody else's account without permission. And as you can see in the green bars, people were much more likely to have committed one of these crimes motivated by gambling than not related to gambling. And so we can truly see there is a relationship between, you know, kind of seeking help for problem gambling and the existence of actually commission of a crime, even though most of the people, since over 56% had admitted to committing crime, but only 14% were facing any consequences. Most people do not face consequences for these different acts. So then I was really curious, which types of crimes, including the kind of violent crimes, were people ever found convicted of, if it was motivated by gambling or not related to gambling. And as you can see from the left side of the screen, which focuses more on the acquisitional financial crimes, from the right side of the screen, which is more the violent crimes, you can see that the majority of these people had committed and been convicted of a financial type crime. Very few people had been convicted of any kind of crimes that were more violent, but when they were, it was not related to their gambling. So it kind of dispels that myth that they're just a bunch of bad eggs committing crimes. Instead, the idea is that there's something going on acquisitional that has led to these crimes. And also, if they were convicted of a crime, it was much more likely to be an acquisitional crime in general. So then I was also curious, were there certain kinds of those social and economic consequences that were more likely to lead to commission of crime? And unfortunately, because over 3/4 of problem gamblers had said they borrowed money to gamble, actually it was 3/4 of gamblers said they had borrowed money to gamble. That was actually the largest predictor for commission of a crime by problem gambler 4 times more likely if somebody had done that or not versus not for them to have actually committed a crime. And if you think about, we always are talking about the progression of problem gambling, but we don't often talk about the progression of the social and economic consequences, and especially the economic consequences. So what probably likely occurs that some of my research is focused on now is that people run out of the legal avenues to money, payday loans, credit card advances, cashing checks, etc. And it's when they're kind of running out of that, one of the last things they might do is actually borrow money from somebody else, because now you owe somebody and you may have lied about why you were borrowing that money, because a lot of, as you know, compulsive gamblers try to hide their behavior, they try to hide their losses, etc. So if they're trying to hide this, they're probably not admitting to the people, for the most part, why they're borrowing money. And so a lot of people end up doing this, and then they're actually 4 times more likely to commit a crime, because it's probably the last step before they run out of those legal avenues. Then I was also curious which crimes were most likely to lead to a conviction, because we know they commit all sorts of crimes, but which ones would most likely lead to a conviction? And embezzlement was 8 times more likely. That probably doesn't surprise you. Embezzlement is usually against an employer, and employers, in order to get the money back, even from insurance reasons, they're much more likely to press charges. They're also less likely to feel like they have a relationship with their employee, to the sense that they don't want their employee to get in trouble. Now, I can tell you that from my experience in working with people who have faced these types of crimes, lots of employers do try to work with the employees and do not press charges. But in most cases, this is why it's 8 times more likely to end up with conviction if there's an embezzlement than if there's not. But then taking out a credit card in someone else's name, which is usually a family member or friend, you're 5.5 times more likely to be convicted of a crime. And if you think about it, people probably don't want to pay off the debt that was formed by somebody else taking out that credit card. And so it turns into a fraud that then can result in a conviction. Now, other types of gambling motivated crimes absolutely may result in an arrest and convictions. So I don't want you to be like, okay, my client did not commit one of those, they're good. No, lots of different kinds of crimes can result in this. But it does mean that if somebody did commit one of these specific types of crimes, based on my research, they are more likely to be found guilty of a convicted for that crime, sorry. So what happens once they're convicted? Well, from the beginning of being arrested all the way through conviction and possible incarceration, there are a lot of issues going on for problem gamblers and people with gambling disorder in the criminal justice system. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what the research is kind of showing in that area. First off, the entire system, from police officers who may be investigating to public defenders and privately paid defenders, prosecutors, and judges, and then those people who kind of work within corrections, they don't understand problem gambling. Well, a lot of money from the federal government, some state governments, has gone towards training all these professionals in these areas of what to do and assess for drugs and alcohol. They're not doing that when it comes to problem gambling. And so they don't understand a gambling motivated crime. They just see that other reason, greed. And of course, gambling is a separate motivator, but they don't understand it. And then once somebody's in the system, they're not assessed for problem gambling. And so they don't receive any treatment once they're in the system. So the likelihood that they can even attend a Gamblers Anonymous meeting, much less see a counselor who is certified for helping somebody with a gambling problem, goes way down. They don't understand Gamblers Anonymous. Only 5%, according to research, only 5% of jails and prisons actually have even assessed for this, and less than that have Gamblers Anonymous meetings. And again, there's no money going in, so there's not really the impetus for them to allow these things to start. Many states and some federal governments do allow for Gamblers Anonymous meetings, but it's definitely not that frequent, and it's definitely not considered a necessity within the CJ system. So that makes it really different. It is not treated like other addictions where people kind of can receive some therapeutic jurisprudence and therapy and possible rehabilitation if they end up in the criminal justice system for these kinds of crimes. And then similar to that, there's a lack of diversion programs in courts. I'll talk a little bit more about diversion courts in a bit. And in fact, the first one that was ever started was in Western New York. It doesn't exist anymore. It kind of got put into the mental health courts. I'm not 100% sure how people are assessed for that. But other than that, currently there's one really existent standalone gambling diversion court in the United States. That's in Clark County, Nevada, where Las Vegas is. People are probably like, of course they would have one, but really it's a very small program. It's fairly new. It is legislatively through the state supposed to exist all over the state, and still only one county actually has one. So there is a huge lack of these programs. But I will say, as I'll talk about later, other jurisdictions are looking into starting these kinds of programs. What do those do? They take the person who has these addictions or other mental health issues, depending on the diversion court, out of traditional jurisprudence, and they put them into therapy. They are being supervised by this kind of diversion program or diversion court to make sure they're not continuing their addiction, that they're working, that they're in therapy, that they're going to, whatever 12-step program is relevant for here, it would be GA, et cetera. And they have to do it for a long period of time, but it lets them stay in the community and get the help they need. But that's not what's happening in the criminal justice system for most problem gamblers. There are small places that do have some diversion programs that they will apply to gambling, but most people don't even know to ask for it because they don't exist as a standalone program. Then once people are in the CJ system, there's almost no programming. I already mentioned they don't necessarily have meetings, but there's actually almost no programming, and also no training for the correctional personnel to understand these issues. So a lot of times people who are found guilty of these crimes are told stay out of gambling establishments. But really, jails and prisons can be full of gambling. In fact, the highest prevalence of problem gambling of any community are those people within correctional facilities. Research has shown up to 30% of people in prisons, and most of this research is done on men, may have a gambling problem. And the amount of people who have a gambling problem going in actually increases while they're on the inside. And more people are leaving these gambling these prisons with a gambling problem than are entering. So they're not only not receiving treatment, but they're probably cross-addicting because they don't have as much access to drugs and alcohol to gambling, where they can gamble on cards and sports. And of course, the consequences of this gambling in the criminal justice system can be very severe, because if they don't have the money to pay up, they might be paying with their life. Additional issues is a lot of times people from these acquisitional crimes have very high restitution, which is the amount of money they have to pay back. It doesn't go directly to the person they took the money from, but it goes into a victim's fund. And sometimes this restitution can be in the millions, but you're putting somebody into jail or prison, and how are they ever going to be able to get a good enough job to even remotely pay on their restitution, where if you somehow can keep them out of jail and prison and give them therapy, they may be able to keep their jobs and one day be able to pay off more of the restitution. We've seen evidence of more severe sentences. I already talked about the gambling within the jails and prisons. So there's a lot of problems, as I could probably point out here, within the criminal justice system when it comes to people who have committed gambling motivated crimes. Based on the severity, they already are severe problem gamblers. And if they're arrested before they're able to seek help, at no point have they been able to even talk to somebody certified to help them around the gambling issues before they end up in the system, which can be really problematic. So some initial solutions to those issues are to include problem gambling assessments of all those accused of crime. From the very beginning, people are assessed for drugs and alcohol. Why not include an assessment around gambling? It doesn't occur most of the time. I know there are exceptions, but that's something that should be done. In a lot of times, we need to be getting public defenders and defense attorneys to ask for expert testimony or assessments from certified problem gambling counselors. A lot of you may fit that molds, some of you may have been asked to write something on behalf of a client. It's really important that we're training the legal professionals to actually even care about those things and utilize them. Develop treatment programs and offer GA meetings within, or any other recovery within jails and prisons, so that people who do end up in those situations have access to recovery resources, and then also including books and other resources on problem gambling in jails and prison libraries. A lot of them don't have much at all. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a kind of a big proponent for these gambling treatment diversion courts, and really hope to see a lot more of these forming throughout the country. And I mentioned that we need to be using screening tools, and there's so, obviously most assessments are quite long, but there are two potentially really relevant screening tools that could at least start the conversation when people are arrested and or going through their pre-sentence report or whatever it is, to try to figure out if this individual actually might need assistance around gambling or might need a diversion program. And obviously I'm using two that you probably are aware of: the brief biosocial gambling screen and the LIBET questionnaire, both of which, one has 3 questions, one has 2 questions. And if people answer yes to those questions, they should be further assessed. And if they say no to the questions, you're probably not dealing with somebody whose crime was possibly predicated on some motivation around problem gambling. But wouldn't it be just so simple to just include these few questions? But that's not usually what's happening in the criminal justice system. So I did promise early on that I will have advice for all of you who may have clients facing legal consequences of problem gambling. The first thing is that you should actually always ask them if they've committed a crime, even if the assessment doesn't include that anymore because the DSM-5 had dropped it. And the thing I'm going to put out there is a lot of people will say no immediately, even if they have. And the reason they'll say no is because they don't trust you, because admitting to it means they may have to face consequences. So just know that you may have to ask more than once, and you will have to obtain their trust and help them go through all their consequences. I'll tell you, most problem gamblers do not consider the writing of a bad check a crime, even though that would be a crime. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of people have written a bad check at a casino, for example, or owe money at the casino because they wrote bad checks. Technically, that's a crime that's going to be handled more civilly than in the criminal sense, but still, it's important for them to kind of get all that out. The biggest advice you can tell them if they do admit to having committed a crime is to get an attorney, even if they need a public defender. Yes, public defenders in general do not have a lot of knowledge around this, but every person needs to have legal representation. As somebody who has a JD, the first thing I will always tell somebody is go get a lawyer. That's the most important thing they can do. And if they don't have the money to hire one themselves, they should reach out for a public defender. It's better than trying to go it alone. And then they should never answer any questions from a former employer, from family members, police, without an attorney. And now you should know a lot of people who are in this situation have a lot of shame and guilt, and they want to scream from the rooftop everything they did once they kind of come clean that they have a gambling addiction. But it's really important that they know it's actually number 7 on this list, but they need to take the benefits of the protections of the US legal system, which includes the right to remain silent. Let the others kind of figure out whether the person's going to be found guilty. I will tell you, I personally know an individual who walked himself into the police station for a crime he was never going to get caught doing because he just had so much shame and guilt. He spent 5 years in the federal system, and him looking back, he's like, while he may not have faced criminal consequences, and he's glad, he's in recovery now and he faced the consequences, he knows that walking in and just admitting everything was not in his best interest because he couldn't get any of the benefits of potential like diversion, etc. And they shouldn't talk about these offenses anywhere but in counseling, where there's confidentiality with an attorney. And that's really hard because they'll probably want to say it in their GA meetings or any other recovery meetings they're in or with the sponsor. But it's really important that they know that, there's not guaranteed anonymity and confidentiality. You never know who you're talking to. And the best advice can ever give a client who may be facing one of these is to just keep doing the next right thing. They should go to GA meetings or other recovery meetings. I kind of push GA, but GA is not the only answer for everybody. They need addiction-focused counseling. If they've lost a job, they should get a new job. It doesn't have to be a forever job. It just needs to be a job. They need to be able to show whenever and if they're facing legal consequences, they're doing the right things today. And I will tell you that nothing may happen overnight. I have seen it from the point where somebody was caught taking money from an employer, and within 30 days, they spent time in jail because they'd been arrested and all that, to people where it's taken 4+ years for them to face their legal consequences. So in that time, if they have any time between coming clean and admitting they have a problem and seeking help to when they actually face the legal consequences, the best thing they can do is be in recovery, work the steps, work with a counselor, do whatever they need to do to better their life. And all that will help them as they face any possible legal consequences. And a lot of people will think they're going to face legal consequences. They'll imagine that the police are going to be at the door any day. But as I pointed out, only 14% of those who have committed a crime actually face consequences. So a lot of the clients who have all the shame and guilt about having committed a crime may not actually face those consequences. So as long as they're doing the next right thing, their life will get back on track and they'll be able to, possibly have a better future without gambling. So I've talked a lot about those things, but another big thing is especially when clients, you'll often have clients say, why couldn't I stop? Why couldn't I stop? But the bigger question for a lot of people who've committed these gambling motivated crimes is, how could I have done this when it is so against who I am? It's against my nature to have committed a crime. I'm a giver, not a taker, etc. And I have found that when talking with people who have gambling disorder about the effect on the brain, which most people just say, I understand that drugs and alcohol can affect somebody's behavior, but why would gambling do that? I think these studies, I have 3 slides of incredible studies I did not do, but I think are so telling about how similar gambling is to drug and alcohol addiction in terms of how it affects the brain. It really has helped a lot of people I know who've committed these kinds of crimes understand why they may have gone where they never would have thought to go. And so, for example, the study around cocaine and gambling showing the resemblance of how certain kinds of receptors in the brain between the addict versus the control are very different. And that the brain of a gambler looks a lot more like the brain of a cocaine addict than somebody who's in the control. And so I think that it can be very telling. And another one is the incredible studies that have been done around gambling and dopamine and those kinds of receptors, showing that there is a huge effect when somebody is a problem gambler on the brain and its response to certain kinds of in the reward systems, and that they need to keep gambling. And so they may have run out of money, but they need to keep gambling, and there's a reason. And if that is fueling their belief, they're no longer able to think rationally, and they're not making the rational decisions and that they would have made had they not had these problems with gambling. And so I always want to keep in mind that there is a huge connection, I believe, between people who commit crimes, gambling motivated crimes, and suicidality. As you know, right now, we have the estimate that 20% of gambling addicts attempt suicide, which might be the highest percentage of all addictions. So if somebody you're probably already assessing for suicidality, but I would say that the percentage of people who have committed one of these crimes is more likely to be suicidal, either prior to commission or after. And the reason I say this, and one of my hypotheses that I'm looking at in current research, is that because gambling disorder causes these increase in social, economic, and potentially legal consequences, the people feel shame and guilt. So there's that kind of negative emotions caused by these. And that would lead to 2 possibilities: commission of a crime because they've run out of all these legal avenues to obtain money, or suicidality. But if they've then committed a crime, which is kind of the ultimate legal consequence, obviously, of commission of having a gambling problem, then they probably have a much more increased likelihood to be suicidal or to attempt suicide. So I think there's a strong link here. And so I just beg of anybody who does work with gambling, with problem gamblers, to do that. I also want to emphasize that there are a lot of resources, even during COVID, for people. I always put this out there. I'm sure you all are familiar with this. I would always recommend you, as you at the bottom of the screen, to go to the problem gambling resource centers offered by New York State, since that's the conference we're with. But just know, even outside of the traditional things, because of COVID and everything, there's Zoom meetings, there's so many things to help problem gamblers. So I always kind of put that out there. And I know you guys actually had Jody Bechtel talk this morning. She might have been pushing her book. I'm not sure, because I unfortunately wasn't able to be at the session. But the last chapter of her book with Alyssa Wilson actually is a really good start to the conversation around how practitioners need to be prepared to work with people who may have committed gambling motivated crimes. And actually the three of us, along with Judge Moss, who started the diversion court out in Las Vegas, are actually going to be doing a pre-conference workshop at the national conference in Boston. So if you happen to be there, you can come check it out. It'll be some of what I've talked about, but much more practitioner focused in terms of how to work directly with individuals who've committed these crimes. And so with just under 10 minutes left, I will stop my presentation there. I hope I've shared some good information with you all, and I welcome any questions you may have.
A phenomenal presentation, Dr. Malkin. A lot of really good information, extremely informative. We have a few questions here, and you wrapped it up just in time. I'm just going to look through the chat and pick out one or two of the questions that have been posed. So we have a question from Jeffrey Savoy. Does the criminal justice to treatment referral mechanism exist in New York State? Similar to drug courts, but since gambling itself may be illegal, not quite the same. Forgive me if this is a newbie question.
Okay, so very different from people who are engaging in illegal gambling and may commit crime associated with that. So most of the crimes that I am looking at least in today, because of the proliferation of legalized gambling, most of these individuals are engaged in some sort of legal gambling, from casinos to sports betting, online betting. Now there's so many forms of betting. Sometimes it's illegal because they're in a state or somewhere where it's not legal, but they're accessing it. But for the most part, it's more about the progression of the problem gambler. In New York State, I know that at least there's rumor about them looking to a diversion kind of court in the future. They're one of the jurisdictions that we're hoping will form these types of alternative therapeutic programs. And there may be some smaller jurisdictions, including in Western New York, as I mentioned, where they used to have a diversion court. I know they still do some diversion programming. It's not specifically a diversion court. But overall, in the state of New York, most people who commit these types of crimes are going through the traditional system and ending up in jails and prisons.
We have another question from one of my colleagues, actually, in Finger Lakes region, Jenna Hotling. How do you factor in the validity of the findings in the presentation? And for example, people not fully sharing their gambling tendencies?
That's a great question. And I was really kind of worried about that. But if you actually look at the history of studies with people who are already seeking help for problem gambling, which in this case they were already in Gamblers Anonymous, I did not assess for whether they were problem gamblers or the severity, because they identified themselves as problem gamblers. So I didn't have to worry about where they were in the severity. I just wanted to see what kind of social and economic and legal consequences they faced. It matched very closely with prior studies that had said that over 50% of people seeking help had committed crimes. So because the overall data matched so well with prior studies in those kinds of ways, it helped to establish validity overall. But there's more I could talk about, but I don't want to take up too much time on that.
Okay, I have like one more question I can ask. How do we drill down with law enforcement authorities to get at an underlying gambling problem? Or is it just through informal relationships?
I think that's a great question. You know, every organization, just like you all here, has conferences and trainings, and everybody needs continuing education and training. So what we need to do is be putting together more trainings around problem gamblers that are geared toward law enforcement, lawyers, judges, etc., around problem gambling. Train them on these issues so that they know about it and give them the resources of the kinds of assessments they can be using. And so what we have found is for those places that have had those kinds of trainings, they are much more likely to actually at least do the 2-question live back questionnaire because they're even aware to look at these issues.
Okay, and probably to squeeze in one more question, would it be safe to say that women tend to go through a divorce due to their gambling activities?
So I will not say I'm an expert on whether men or women are more likely to get a divorce due to gambling. What I will say is that the divorce rate can be quite high for any individual who has gambling disorder. And so I personally don't know if there's a big difference in gender based on that. What I will say is when we look at the statistic that women are more likely to be widowed or divorced, we also find traditionally, and this is historical, that women were more likely to start gambling later in life and therefore become problem gamblers later in life, where they might have faced those kinds of consequences in their life already. So I don't know the exact connection, and I don't want to claim that I do. I think we have time for one more if you have it.
I'm looking through the chat. I think I covered all of the questions that have been asked.
Awesome.
A lot of comments were noted saying excellent, informative and provocative presentation, outstanding presentation. So they were very happy with all of the information that you provided, found it very interesting. Oh, I see one question. What percentage of incarcerated people have gambling problems?
Well, I kind of talked about that as what we have found is that those people who are incarcerated have the highest prevalence of problem gambling. Some studies have shown up to 30% of those people incarcerated in the United States may have a problem gambling. And as I said before, that percentage can actually increase while they're on the inside as they cross-addict from addictions that they had on the outside and not necessarily getting the help they need. They will turn to gambling, or they could just develop the addiction while they're on the inside because it's so common. I mean, I've heard of people who are gambling over everything on the inside, from Scrabble games and cards to, as I mentioned before, sports is probably the most frequent form of gambling. When I talk to people who work in prisons and jails, and even though I'm often talking to them about something totally unrelated, I'll say, hey, do you notice much gambling going on? Because I'm just kind of curious. And they often say, oh, it's always about sports. But when I've talked with places that are women's corrections, it's been very interesting. They're like, oh, they literally gamble over everything, especially things like Survivor and who's going to be voted off. I mean, I was like, really? And they're like, they get so into those TV shows. That's what they're gambling over in the women's side. I don't know if that's different for men and women. I can't wait to try to do that research. But literally, people on the inside are gambling over a lot of different things.
Okay, well, I can't thank you enough, Dr. Malkin, for a phenomenal presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you all that have attended this particular session, and it was full of great information. I just want to remind everyone, our next session will begin at 3:30 p.m. and that will be Journey to Discover Me. And please stay tuned for more information on our conference. So I hope you all have a blessed evening, and thank you again, Dr. Malkin.
Thank you. This is wonderful. I appreciate it so much.
Okay, bye-bye.
This was a fabulous presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Malkin.
Thank you.